So just for a moment to project a little bit on what would happen, and then talk about what has to happen. I think the reality is that if we go down the current path, the impact of climate change on a divided world will become progressively more severe. You can't give a timescale. It might be 5, 10, 15, even 20 years, but it will tend to get more and more difficult. It will tend to get more and more constrained. And the problem here is that unless you take the kinds of actions that need to be taken now, then essentially you end up with a very dangerous environment. I'll give you two examples from very far-sighted indications of this. The first is from a very good writer, I think largely unrecognized by now, an economic geographer by the name of Edwin Brooks. And he was writing in the early 1970s. I remember vividly a lecture he gave in which he said, what we face was the risk of a crowded, glowering planet of massive inequalities of wealth, buttressed by stark force, yet endlessly threatened by desperate people in the global ghettos. That was in 1973, and he was looking 30 to 40 years ahead, and we're getting closer to that now. The other example, I don't know if some of you may remember it, a remarkable long film made by a consortium of television stations in Britain, in Europe, about 21 years ago, called The March. I don't know if any of you recall that. It came out almost at the same time that the Soviet Union imploded, and therefore it did get a great deal of attention. If you ever get a chance to see it, it's remarkable. We have a Peace Film Festival in Bradford at the National Media Museum, and they managed to get hold of a copy, and we showed it to a mixed group of peace studies and media students. And from their two perspectives, they were really quite gobsmacked by it. It features Juliet Stevenson in one of her earlier acting roles as an EU Commissioner for Development, very much the professional politician and very ambitious initially. And what it tells is the story of a charismatic young teacher in a refugee camp, presumably somewhere in Sudan, saying to his fellow refugees, if we live like this, we will die. What we must do is walk to Europe. And most of the film is taken up with this effort of a small group which slowly gets bigger and bigger in size to do the walk across North Africa to Morocco and then try and get into Europe. At one point, early in the film, the commissioner, played by Juliet Stevenson, meets this charismatic young leader. And she says to him, what do you want? And he says, well, madam, we understand that the average family in Europe spends about $50 a year on their dogs and cats. We'd like to come and replace them. You can pet us, you can have us in front of your fire, and we will be your pets. That's all we need. It was a gripping part of the film. What happened eventually was they made their progress. Sometimes they were helped, sometimes they were hindered by the countries through which they passed. They were helped by a politically astute American politician who backed them with some resources. They got to Morocco, and they managed to get, Marley through his efforts, all sorts of ships and boats together, and this sort of flotilla went across and landed on the coast of Spain in a resort which had been evacuated. And the end of the film was basically that resort with these thousands upon thousands of people landing ashore, entirely surrounded by the new uniformed European border security patrols. And that was the end of the film itself. Now that was actually all about the impact of climate change. It's actually filmed 21 years ago. It's quite astonishing. But again, that would be the kind of protection they would have. And the risk is that it is a matter of control. So let's finally, for a few minutes, talk about what the alternatives have to be, and at least suggest, well, I think this is mainly going to be in discussion at further sessions tomorrow and elsewhere this week, in terms of what can actually be done. In some ways, it's really relatively straightforward. On the whole issue of the socioeconomic divide, trying to move towards much greater emancipation and at least a greater degree of equity, then we have to have a transformation both within Western economies and the global system as well. We still have a position even now, we tend to forget about it, where there is a massive debt burden on many countries in the South. Even now, even with all the efforts of Jubilee 2000 and the rest, there is still a huge debt burden. And that has to be turned around. It is not hugely costly to the wealthier countries, but it would make a massive difference to a whole range of countries across the South. We still have the absolute vitality of going for trade reform. The fair trade system is powerful as a domestic tool. It's even more powerful as an educational tool. You go right back many, many years ago to the founding of the one UN body that has tried to bring trade and development together, UNCTAD, UN Conference on Trade and Development. When it was set up right back in 1963-64, they had this brilliant team of trade economists led by the Argentinian economist Raul Prebisch, and they put together a seminal document called Towards a Trade Policy for Development. Came out in 1963, it was known almost immediately as the Prebisch Report, it's still available online, and basically that set out the way in which you semi-plan the world economy in terms of commodity agreements, tariff preferences, compensatory finance, trade in invisibles and all the other things in such a way that you divert the nature of the world economy so that it actually aids the South rather than aids the North. Because the history of so many years over the decades has been the transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich, not the other way around. Now, UNCTAD tried hugely in the 1970s to implement that kind of thing, and it's really at the heart of the fair trade movement now. It never worked with UNCTAD. The richer states were not willing to do it. In fact, as some of you will recall, there was this rather cynical view that UNCTAD no longer stood for the UN Conference on Trade and Development, but it stood for under no circumstances take any decisions. And in a sense, that was the reality. But again, where we are now, you still have to make as powerfully as possible the link between trade and development. And I think some of the groups, including ones that Quakers are involved in, like World Development, are trying to do this constantly. At the same time, any kind of development process in the South has to be of a nature which doesn't damage its own environment or the global environment. And that has to be an issue for any kind of aid that is provided. But that has to be provided very much with eyes open as to the difficulties of doing that. And it is worse than useless unless the major industrialized countries are right at the forefront in making the transition to a low-carbon economy. And we're not talking about mild changes. We're not talking about 60% reductions in carbon emissions by 2050. We're talking about 80% reductions by 2030 at the latest, right across the more carbon-emitting countries. Now that is something which again is as transformative in a way as the economic changes we need to make. But again, an extraordinary amount of work is going on in this kind of issue at the present time. You look at the work that the New Economics Foundation is doing on the Great Transition Project, which is about trying to remodel, use modern day econometrics to model economies in which you feed in these issues like the need to go ultra low carbon. And you see what kind of economic systems might work to do that. Now, one of the real problems with all of this is the risk that when we see what has to be done, it just gets massively daunting. In a sense, we look ahead and see that there's actually going to be a need for a transformation, which is quite incredible, and it's going to have to be done really in the next, it's got to have to be embarked on in a major way in the next 5, 10, at the very most in the next 15 years. But at the same time, I think one always has to look at these things with a degree of hope and expectation and confidence. I love the definition of prophecy as being prophecy is simply suggesting the possible. And that, in a sense, is the kind of era we're in at the present time. But let's just think a little bit more about this. I mentioned earlier on the fact that if we'd been meeting here 25 years ago, there would have been, I think, quite a lot of depression about the risk of an all-out nuclear war. Within, 5 years or so, that at least had partly passed. And that was due to many things, some of them very unexpected. If you go back even further, I think you can argue quite reasonably that some of the people who were in the very early era of trying to get European economic cooperation, back in the late 40s and early 50s, people like Monnet and Schumann, they were actually embarking on a generational project, a project to prevent a third European civil war. Now, you may agree or disagree with the form that the European Union has taken, the bureaucracy, the stultification and the rest, but one cannot deny there is not a great risk currently of the French and Germans going to war with each other. And essentially, that was looking long term. We don't actually have the benefit of those sorts of timescales now, but we do have the possibility of making the changes. Two things that are worth exploring very quickly. One, perhaps unexpectedly, is the rate at which, in certain circumstances, quite empowering technologies can help. There are some remarkable areas of research going on now on the whole business of capturing solar radiation, photovoltaics and the rest. They're becoming very much more efficient. We're now moving into what are called third-generation quantum well photovoltaics, things which actually absorb light of a longer range of wavelengths from a wider range of angles more efficiently. They're far too expensive to use for anything except things like satellites, but the price will come down. Look at the way in which technologies can spread very quickly, the way in which mobile phone technology is actually having a very big economic impact in parts of Africa. And you can apply that to other forms. Now, there's always the great danger that in a huge area of need, when new technologies come up, they come under the control of relatively small groups. And one of the most important things to ensure that that is avoided, and they are linked in with other processes which gear towards economic transformation, essentially emancipation, if you like. But there are all sorts of possibilities there, and one of the great things is the way in which there's far more work going on this, and things can change quite quickly. I'd also cite in many ways, and this maybe is a rather negative way of looking at it, that you're likely to get many markers which are going to indicate the need for more rapid change. In one sense, I think the biggest failure of the last 3 years is to not recognize how dangerous 2008 was, the dangers we're now in, and how they are markers for the very big changes in economies that have got to come. Tobin tax and all the rest for starters. There are also very clear indications that there are different ways in which climate change might speed up and have big impacts in the short term. I mentioned the near Arctic, the Palearctic. You have issues like the risk of the melting of the permafrost shoving out more methane, which is a very potent climate change gas. What I'm trying to get at is there may be kind of warning signs which become more obvious. Now, there's a great risk here because you can immediately hear people saying, yeah, things have got to get worse before they get better. I really am very dubious about that. But at the same time, if you get markers, indicators, there is the possibility that people would take action more quickly to prevent things getting worse before they get better. Which brings me back to the point, in many ways, what one is trying to do is to suggest possible alternatives, to suggest the possible, prophecy suggesting the possible. And I think that is the kind of work, I think it has to be done in universities, in think tanks, but it's also got to be done by the NGOs, the ones, many of which I know that Quakers support. But it doesn't go that far because it still leaves us with what do we do as individuals? And the real risk is a kind of feeling of almost powerlessness. Now, I know I'm talking among a group of people who by and large do not feel that way, who are in it for the long term. But not everybody has that view. And it's very easy for people to be so dismayed at the prospects that they essentially give up. I think there are just 2 or 3 things to say about this. One is that many people in this whole field of what you might call development, environment, peace work, might work in one particular area. They might concentrate on something like asylum seekers. They might be working with amnesty. They might be working with fair trade. They may be active in something like Greenpeace or one of the more active groups on climate change. The point is that anybody who has any kind of interest like that, all they have to do is to say they're actually part of a much wider movement. And they cannot and must not be expected to do everything, to be engaged in everything. But everybody who is involved in any kind of thing like that is actually part of this wider thing. And all one has to do, I think, is in a sense to recognize that, because that itself is empowering. It means that if you see that you're part of a wider group and other people doing other things are all part of the whole, it gives oneself rather more confidence, rather more hope. But in the final analysis, I think it is a matter of maintaining a degree of hope, one of the virtues after all. And in one real sense, I think that this is why the next maybe 10 years through to about 2020 is going to be so significant and so important. I think there's a very real possibility, I think a hope even, that over the next decade we will move into the kind of era where it becomes so much more obvious that this kind of analysis has got its finger on the pulse, and that we have very big changes that we're going to have to make, and that they will become more acceptable through the work of individuals, small groups, persistent people, think tanks, and the rest. To that extent, I think we should always be optimistic, even when at times it looks fairly bleak. I must admit, I'm sure some of the older ones among us will share this, it's actually quite salary to have grandchildren. There's Zoe, who's 2 years old. She and her mother and dad live in Switzerland. We see them 2 or 3 times a year. There's Ben, 3 months old. My wife and I saw him just for the first time 3 weeks ago. And you think, gosh, this is the next generation coming through. And essentially, I think that itself is something which must make us more determined to look to the future. Whatever age we are, through to 20, through to 80, there is a huge amount of work we can do. Let me finish at that point. What I've tried to do is sketch out what I think are going to be some very big issues, but also to make it absolutely clear that we do not have to go down that path. The other path, one which we are going to travel and have to travel, is the one which is going to take a huge amount of effort to get there, but it is tremendously worthwhile to do. And if we end up bequeathing a world which in 50 or 60 years' time, people look back and say, yeah, that decade, that century, 1945 to 2045, was the key one. And gosh, in the final analysis, we really got things at least half right, and we can move on from there.